Okay, everyone, we are here in the reading room. I actually wasn't going to start right away, but I did. Only because I wanted to get another drink before we get started, because it's a long section in the chapter. We're only on chapter 3, but it's a long section. And I know we've already read twice from chapter 3. But I did get, well, my iced tea. And I did get my magnifying glass. Because there's a few footnotes. So remember, we stop at the footnotes a little bit, right? Not a little bit, but sometimes they're long footnotes. So sometimes, yeah, it is a minute. The gangster we're all looking for. How much Beely knew about the gangster, we will never know. She claims that he only told her he was a businessman. Of course, I believed him. How was I supposed to know different? Well, he certainly was a businessman, but he was also a flunky for the Trujillo, and not a minor one. Don't misunderstand. Our boy wasn't no ring wraith, but he wasn't no orc either. Okay. I don't know what a ring wraith is. Or an orc. I'm looking to see if it's or, but it's not. It's an orc. A fruit flies on its last journey. Due partially to Beely's silence on the matter and other folks' lingering unease when it comes to talking about the regime, info on the gangster is fragmented. I'll give you what I've managed to unearth, and the rest will have to wait for the day the Paginas and Blanco finally speak. The gangster was born in Samana at the dawn of the 20s, the fourth son of a milkman, a bawling, worm-infested brat no one thought would amount to an opinion his parents endorsed by turning him out of the house when he was 7. But folks always underestimate what the promise of a lifetime of starvation, powerlessness, and humiliation can provoke in a young person's character. By the time the gangster was 12, this scrawny, unremarkable boy had shown a resourcefulness and fearlessness beyond his years. His claim that the failed cattle thief had inspired him brought him to the attention of the secret police. And before you could say Sim Salabin, our boy was infiltrating unions and fingering syndications left and right. At age 14, he killed his first comunista, a favor for the appalling Felix Bernardino. And apparently the hit was so spectacular, so fucking chunky, that half the left in Bonnie immediately abandoned the Dominican Republic for the relative safety of Nueva York. So, Felix Bernardino. Felix Bernardino. So we have a footnote here. Felix Wenceslao Bernardino, raised in La Romana, one of Trujillo's most sinister agents. They all are. They're like the worst of the worst. And then the next one is just the worst of the worst. His Witch King, I gotta get this right. I'm not getting it. There we go. Of Angmar was consul to Cuba when the exiled Dominican labor organizer Mauricio Diaz was mysteriously murdered on the streets of Havana. Remember, he was one of the horrible ones too. Felix was also rumored to have had a hand in the failed assassination of Dominican exile leader Angel Morales. The assassination burst in on his secretary shaving, mistook the lathered man for Morales, and shot him to pieces. In addition, Felix and his sister, Minerva Bernardina, first woman in the world to be an ambassador before the United Nations, were both in New York City when Jesus de Galindez mysteriously disappeared on his way home at the Columbus Circle subway station. Talk about have gun will travel. There we go. I'm turning it. It was said the power of Trujillo never left him. The fucker died of old age in Santo Domingo. Trujillista to the end, drowning his Haitian workers instead of paying them. All right, well, that sounds pretty terrible. We'll go with that. He's a terrible guy. From that point on, the sky was the limit for our young villain. Over the next decade, he traveled back and forth to Cuba, dabbling in forgery, theft, extortion, and money laundering, all for the everlasting glory of the Trujillado. It was even rumored, never substantiated, that our gangster was the hammerman who slew Mariacho Diaz in Havana in 1950. Who could know? It seems a possibility. By then he'd acquired deep contacts in the Havana underworld and clearly had no compunction about slaying motherfuckers. Hard evidence, though, is scarce. That he was a favorite of Johnny Abe's and of Porfirio Rubirosa, there can be no denying. He had a special passport from the Palacio and the rank of major in some branch of the secret police. Skilled our gangster became in many perfidy, but where our man truly excelled, where he smashed records and grabbed gold, was in the flesh trade. Then, like now, Santo Domingo was to Popola what Switzerland was to chocolate. And there was something about the binding, selling, and degradation of women that brought out the best in the gangster. He had instinct for it, a talent. Call him the Caracaracal of Coelho. By the time he was 22, he was operating his own string of brothels in and around the capital, owned houses and cars in 3 countries, never stinted to the jefe or anything, be it money, praise, or a prime cut of Coelho from Colombia, and so loyal was he to the regime that he once slew a man at a bar simply for pronouncing El Jefe's mother's name wrong. Now here's a man, El Jefe was rumored to have said, who was capaz. The gangster's devotion did not go unrewarded. By the mid-40s, the gangster was no longer simply a well-paid operator. He was becoming an Alguien. In photos, he appears in the company of the regime's 3 witch kings, Johnny Abe's, Joaquin Balaguer, and Felix Bernardino. And while none exists of him and El Jefe, that they broke bread and talked shit cannot be doubted. For it was the great I himself who granted the gangster authority over a number of Trujillo families' concessions in Venezuela and Cuba, and under his draconian administration, the so-called bang for the buck ratio of Dominican sex workers trebled. In the 40s, the gangster was in his prime. He traveled the entire length of the Americas from Rosario to Nueva York in Pimp Daddy style, staying at the best hotels, banging the hottest broads, never lost his Sereno taste for the morenas, though. Dining in 4-star restaurants, confabbing with arch criminals the world over. An inexhaustible opportunist, he spun deals everywhere he went. Suitcases of dollars accompanied him back and forth from the capital. Life was not always pleasant. Plenty of acts of violence, plenty of beatdowns and knifings. He himself survived any number of gang attempts, and after each shootout, after each drive-by, he always combed his hair and straightened his tie, a dandy's reflex. He was a true gangster, gully to the bone, lived the life all those phony rap acts can only rhyme about. It was also in this period that his long dalliance with Cuba was formalized. The gangster might have harbored love for Venezuela and its many long-legged mulatas, and burned for the tall, icy beauties of Argentina, and swooned over Mexico's incomparable brunettes. But it was Cuba that clove his heart, that felt to him like home. If he spent 6 months out there of 12 in Havana, I'd call that a conservative estimate, and in honor of his predilections, the secret police's code name for him was Max Gomez. So often did he travel to Havana that it was more a case of inevitability than bad luck that on New Year's Eve, 1958, the night that Fulgencio Batista Saco Paez out of Havana and the whole of Latin America changed, the gangster was actually partying with Johnny Abes in Havana, sucking whiskey out of the navels of underage whores when the guerrillas reached Santa Clara. It was only the timely arrival of one of gangster's informants that saved them all. You better leave now or you'll be hanging from your huevos. In one of the greatest blunders in the history of Dominican intelligence, Johnny Abes almost didn't make it out of Havana that New Year's Eve. The Dominicans were literally on the last plane smoking, the gangster's face pressed against the glass, never to return. When Bealey encountered the gangster, that ignominious midnight flight still haunted him. Beyond the financial attachment, Cuba was an important component to his prestige, to his manhood, really, and our man could still not accept the fact that the country had fallen to a rabble of scurvied students. Some days he was better than others, but whenever the latest news reached him of the revolution's activities, he would pull his hair and attack the nearest wall in sight. Not a day passed when he did not fulminate against Batista, that ox, that peasant, or Castro, that goat fucking communista, or CIA chief Alan Dulles, that effeminate who had failed to stop Batista's ill-advised Mother's Day amnesty that freed Fidel and the other Mancadistas to fight another day. If Dulles was right here in front of me, I'd shoot him dead, he swore to Bealey, and then I'd shoot his mother dead. Life, it seemed, had struck the gangster a dolorous blow, and he was uncertain as to how to respond. The future appeared cloudy, and there was no doubt he sensed his own mortality and that of Trujillo and the fall of Cuba, which might explain why, when he met Bealey, he jumped on her stat. I mean, what straight middle-aged brother has not attempted to regenerate himself through the alchemy of young pussy? And if what she often said to her daughter was true, Bealey had some of the finest pussy around. The sexy isthmus of her waist alone could have launched 1,000 Yolas, and while the upper-class boys might have had their issues with her, the gangster was a man of the world. He fucked more prietas than you could count. He didn't care about that shit. What he wanted was to suck Bealey's enormous breast, to fuck her pussy until it was a mango juice swamp, to spoil her senseless so that Cuba and his failure there disappeared. As the viejos say, Klavoskaya Klavo, and only a girl like Bealey could erase that debacle of Cuba from a brother's mind. At first, Bealey had her reservations about the gangster. Her ideal amour had been Jack Puelos, and here was this middle-aged Caliban who dyed his hair and had thatch of curlies on his back and shoulders, more like a third base umpire than an avatar of her glorious future. But one should never underestimate what assiduity can accomplish when assisted by heaping portions of lana and privilege. The gangster romanced the girl like only middle-aged niggers know how, chipped at her reservation with cool aplomb and unself-conscious cursiness. rained on her head enough flowers to garland Azuea, bonfires of roses at the job and at her house. It's romantic, Tina sighed. It's vulgar, La Inca complained. He escorted her to the most exclusive restaurants of the capital, took her to the clubs that had never tolerated a non-musician Prieto inside their door before. Dude was that powerful. That to break the injunction against black, places like Hamaca, the Tropicalia, though not, alas, the country club, even he didn't have the juice. He flattered her with top-notch muelas. From what I heard, he paid a couple of grad school serranos to churn him out. Treated her to plays, movies, dances, bought her wardrobes of clothes and pirate chests of jewelry, introduced her to famous celebrities, and once even to Ramphis Trujillo himself. In other words, he exposed her to the fucking world, at least the one circumscribed by the Dominican Republic. And you'd be surprised how even a hard-headed girl like Beely committed as she was an idealized notion of what love was and could find it in her heart to revise her views, if only for the gangster. He was complicated, some would say comical, affable, some would say laughable, man who would treat Beely very tenderly with great consideration, and under him, literally and metaphorically, the education begun at the restaurant was completed. He was un hombre bien social, enjoyed being out and about, seeing and being seen, and that dovetailed nicely with Beely's own dreams. But also un hombre conflicted about his past deeds. On the one hand, he was proud of what he'd accomplished. I made myself, he told Beely, all by myself. I have cars, houses, electricity, clothes, prendas. But when I was a niño, I didn't even own a pair of shoes, not one pair. I had no family. I was an orphan. Do you understand? She, an orphan herself, understood profoundly. On the other hand, he was tormented by his crimes. When he drank too much, and that was often, he would mutter things like, if you only knew the diableras I've committed, you wouldn't be here right now. And on some nights, she would wake up to him crying. I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean it. And it was on one of those nights while she cradled his head and brushed away his tears that she realized with the start that she loved this gangster. Beely in love, round two. But unlike what happened with Pujols, this was the real deal, pure, uncut, unadulterated love, the holy grail that would so bedevil her children throughout their lives. Consider that Beely had hungered for a chance to be in love and to be loved back, not very long in real time, but a forever by the chronometer of her adolescence. Totally agree with that. Never had the opportunity in her first lost childhood, and in the intervening years her desire for it had doubled over and doubled over like a katana being forged until finally it was sharper than the truth. Boy, do women know that kind of love. We sure do. We sure do. That feeling that's being described right there. We want it more than anything, and we would hold out for it. If we knew we could get it, we would. With the gangster, our girl finally got her chance. Who was surprised that in the final 4 months of her relationship with him, there would be such an outpouring of affection, and expected she, the daughter of the fall, recipient of the heaviest radiations, loved automatically. As for the gangster, he normally would have tried right quick of such an intensely adoring plaything, but our gangster, grounded by the hurricane winds of history, found himself reciprocating, writing checks with his mouth that his ass could never hope to cover. He promised her that once the troubles with the communists were over, he would take her to Miami and to Havana. I'll buy you a house in both places just so you can know how much I love you. A house, she whispered, her hair standing on end. You're lying to me. I do not lie. How many rooms do you want? 10? She said uncertainly. 10 is nothing. Make it 20. The thoughts he put in her head, someone should have arrested him for it. And believe me, La Inca considered it. He's a panderer, she declaimed, a thief of innocence. There's a pretty solid argument to be made that La Inca was right. The gangster was simply an old chulo preying on Billy's naivete. But if you looked at it from, say, a more generous angle, you could argue that the gangster adored our girl, and that adoration was one of the greatest gifts anybody had ever given her. It felt unbelievably good to Beely, shook her to the core. For the first time, I actually felt like I owned my skin, like it was me and I was it. He made her feel guapa and wanted and safe, and no one had ever done that for her. No one. On their nights together, he would pass his hand over her naked body, Narcissus stroking that pool of his, murmuring guapa, guapa over and over. He didn't care about the burn scars on her back. It looks like a painting of a cyclone. And that's what you are, mi negrita, una tormenta en la madrugada. The randy old goat could make love to her from sunup to sundown, and it was he who taught her all about her body, her orgasms, her rhythms, who said, you have to be bold, and for that he must be honored, no matter what happened in the end. This was the affair that once and for all incinerated Beely's reputation in Santo Domingo. No one in Bonnie knew exactly who the gangster was and what he did. He kept his shit hush, hush, hush. But it was enough that he was a man. In the minds of Beely's neighbors, the Priesta Camparona had finally found her true station in life as a cuero. Old-timers have told me that during her last months in the Dominican Republic, Beely spent more time inside the love motels than she had in school. An exaggeration, I'm sure, but a sign of how low our girl had fallen in the Pueblo's estimation. Beely didn't help matters. Talk about a poor winner. Now that she'd vaulted into a higher order of privilege, she strutted around the neighborhood, exulting and heaping steaming piles of contempt on everybody and everything that wasn't the gangster, dismissing her barrio as infierno and her neighbors as brutos and cochinos. She bragged about how she would be living in Miami soon, wouldn't have to put up with this uncountry much longer. Our girl no longer maintained even a modicum of respectability at home, stayed out until all hours of the night, and permed her hair whenever she wanted. La Inca didn't know what to do with her anymore. All her neighbors advised her to beat the girl into a blood clot. You might even have to kill her, they said regretfully, but La Inca couldn't explain what it had meant to find the burnt girl locked in a chicken coop all those years ago, how that sight had stepped into her and rearranged everything so that now she found she didn't have the strength to raise her hand against the girl. She never stopped trying to talk sense into her, though. What happened to college? I don't want to go to college. So what are you going to do? Be a gangster's girlfriend your whole life? Your parents, God rest their souls, wanted so much better for you. I told you not to talk to me about those people. You're the only person I have. And look how well you've treated me. Look how well. Maybe people are right, La Inca despaired. Maybe you are cursed. Beely laughed. You might be cursed, but not me. Even the Chinos had to respond to Beely's change in attitude. We have you go, Juan said. I don't understand. He licked his lips and tried again. We have to you go. You're fired, Jose said. Please leave your apron on the counter. The gangster heard about it, and the next day some of his goons paid the brothers pay the brothers then a visit, and what do you know if our girl wasn't immediately reinstated? It wasn't the same no more, though. The brothers wouldn't talk to her, wouldn't spin no stories about their youth in China and the Philippines. After a couple of days of silent treatment, Beely took the hint and stopped showing up altogether. And now you don't have a job, La Inca pointed out helpfully. I didn't need a job. He's going to buy me a house. A man whose own house you yourself have never visited is promising to buy you a house? And you believe him? Oh, Iha. Yes, sir, our girl believed. After all, she was in love. The world was coming apart at the seams. Santo Domingo was in the middle of a total meltdown. The Trujillo was tottering. Police blockades on every corner, and even the kids she'd gone to school with, the brightest and the best, were being swept up by the terror. A girl from El Rendidor told her that Jack Puelos's little brother had gotten caught organizing against El Jefe, and the colonel's influence could not save the boy from having an eye gouged out with electric shocks. Beely didn't want to hear it. After all, she was in love. In love. She wafted through her day like a woman in a concussion. It's not like she had a number for the gangster or even an address. Bad sign number 1, girls. And he was in the habit of disappearing for days without warning. Bad sign number 2. And now that Trujillo's war against the world was reaching a bitter crescendo, and now that he had Beely on lock, the days could become weeks, and when he reappeared from his business, he would smell of cigarettes and old fear and want only to fuck, and afterward he would drink whiskey and mutter to himself by the Love Motel window. His hair, Beely noticed, was growing gray. She didn't take kindly to the disappearances. They made her look bad in front of La Inca and the neighbors, who were always asking her sweetly, "Where's your savior now, Moses?" She defended him against every criticism, of course. No brother has had a better advocate, but then took it out on his ass upon his return, pouted, and when he reappeared with flowers, made him take her to the most expensive restaurants, pestered him around the clock to move her out of the neighborhood, asked him what the hell he'd been doing those past X days, talked about the wedding she read about in the listin. And just so you can see that La Inca's doubts were not entirely wasted, wanted to know when he was going to bring her his house. Hija de la gran puta, would you stop jodiendome? Jodiendome. We're in the middle of a war here. He stood over her and the wife-beater waving a pistol. Don't you know what the communists do to girls like you? They'll hang you up by your beautiful tits, and then they'll cut them off, just like they did to those whores in Cuba. During one of the gangsters' longer absences, Beely, bored and desperate to escape the schadenfreude of her neighbor's eyes, took it upon herself to ride the Blue Ball Express one last time. In other words, she checked in on her old flames. Ostensibly, she wanted to end things in a formal way, but I think she was just feeling down and wanted male attention, which is fine. But then she made the classic mistake of telling those Dominican hombres about the new love of her life, how happy she was. Sisters, don't ever, ever do this. It's about as smart as telling the judge who's about to sentence you that back in the day, you finger fucked his mother. The car dealer, always so gentle, so decorous, I think that's the right word, threw a whiskey bottle at her, screaming, "Why would I be happy for a stupid, stinking Mona?" They were in his apartment on the Malecon. At least he showed her to his house. Constantina would later crack, and if he had been a better righty, she would have ended up brained, perhaps raped and killed, but his fastball only grazed her, and then it was her turn on the mound. She put him away with 4 sinkers to his head, using the same whiskey bottle he'd thrown at her. 5 minutes later, panting and barefoot in a cab, she was pulled over by the secret police, tipped off because they'd seen her running, and it was only when they questioned her that she realized that she was still holding the bottle, and it had bloody hair on one of its edges. The car dealer's straight blonde hair. Once they heard what happened, they let me go. To his credit, Archimedes acquitted himself in a more mature fashion, maybe because she told him first and had not yet grown flip. After her confession, she heard a little noise from the closet where he was hiding and nothing else. 5 minutes of silence, and then she whispered, "I'd better go." She never saw him again in person, only on TV, giving speeches, and in later years would wonder if he still thought of her as she sometimes did of him. "What have you been up to?" the gangster asked the next time he appeared. "Nothing," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Absolutely nothing." A month before it all blew up, the gangster took Beely on a vacation to his old haunts in Samana. Their first real trip together, a peace offering prompted by a particularly long absence, a promissory note for future trips abroad. For those capitaleños who never leave the 27-day febrero, or who think Guale is the center of the universe, Saman es una chulería. One of the authors of the King James Bible traveled to the Caribbean, and I often think it was a place like Samana that was on his mind when he sat down to pen the Eden chapters. For Eden it was, a blessed meridian where Mar and Sol and Green have forged their union and produced a stubborn people that no amount of highfalutin prose can generalize. Here is another little lengthy footnote. In my first draft, Samana was actually Jaraboca, but then my girl Leonie, resident expert in all things Dominican, pointed out that there are no beaches in Jaraboca. Beautiful rivers, but no beaches. Leone was also the one who informed me that the Perito, see first photographs of chapter 1, ghetto nerd at the end of the world, wasn't popularized until the late 80s, early 90s, but that was one detail I couldn't change, just like the image too much. Forgive me, historians of popular dance. Forgive me. Okay, taking artist liberties. The gangster was in high spirits. The war against the subversives was going swell, it seemed. "We got him on the run," he gloated. "Very soon all will be well." As for Beely, she remembered that trip at the nicest time she'd ever have in the Dominican Republic. She would never again hear the name Samana without recalling that final primavera of her youth, the primavera of her perfection, when she was still young and beautiful. Samana would forever evoke memories of her lovemaking, of the gangster's rough chin scraping her neck, of the sound of Mar Caribe romancing those flawless, resortless beaches, of the safety she experienced, and the promise. 3 photos from the trip, and in every one she's smiling. They did all the stuff we Dominicans love to do on our vacations. They ate pescado frito and waded in the Rio. They walked along the beach and drank rum until the meat behind their eyes throbbed. It was the first time ever that Beely had her own space totally under her control. So while the gangster dozed restfully in his hammock, she busied herself with playing wife and creating a preliminary draft of the household they would soon inhabit. Mornings she would subject the cabana to the harshest of scourings, and banged boisterous profusions of flowers from every beam and around every window, while her bartering produce and fish from the neighbors resulted in one spectacular meal after another, showing off the skills she acquired during the lost years and the gangster's satisfaction, the patting of his stomach, the unequivocal praise, the soft emission of gases as to lay in the hammock. It was music to her ears. In her mind, she became his wife that week in every sense but the legal. She and the gangster had managed to have heart-to-hearts. On the second day after he showed her his old home, now abandoned and hurricane-ruined, she asked, "Do you ever miss having a family?" They were at the only nice restaurant in the city where El Jefe dined on his visits. They'll still tell you that. "You see these people?" He pointed toward the bar. "All these people have families. You can tell by their faces. They have families that depend on them and that they depend on. And for some of them, this is good. And for some of them, this is bad. But it all amounts to the same shit because there isn't one of them who is free. They can't do what they want to do or be who they want to be. I might have me one in the world, but at least I'm free." She had never heard anyone say these words. "I'm free" wasn't a popular refrain in the era of Trujillo, but it struck a chord in her, put La Inca and her neighbors and her still up to the air life in perspective. "I'm free. I want to be like you," she told the gangster days later when they were eating crabs she had cooked in an achiote sauce. He had just been telling her about the nude beaches of Cuba. "You would have been the star of the show," he said, pinching her nipple and laughing. "What do you mean? You want to be like me?" "I want to be free." He smiled and chuckled her and chucked her under the chin. "Then you will be, mi negra bella." The next day, the protective bubble about their idol finally burst, and the troubles of the real world came rushing in. A motorcycle driven by a hugely overweight policeman arrived at their cabana. "Capitan, you're needed in the Palacio," he said from under the chin strap. "More trouble with the subversives, it seems." "I'll send a car for you," the gangster promised. "Wait," she said. "I'll go with you," not wanting to be left again. But he either didn't hear her or didn't care. "Wait, goddammit," she shouted in frustration, but the motorcycle never slowed. "Wait!" The rider never materialized either. Fortunately, Beely had gotten into the habit of stealing his money while he slept so that she could maintain herself during his absences. Otherwise, she would have been stranded on that fucking beach. After waiting 8 hours like Paraguaya, she hoisted her bag, left his shit in the cabana, and marched through the swimming heat like a vengeance on her 2 legs, walked for what felt like half a day, until at last she happened upon a colmado where a couple of sunstroked campesinos were sharing a warm beer while the comadero, seated in the only shade in sight, waved the flies from the dulces. When they realized she was standing over them, they all scrambled to their feet. By then her anger had drained away and she only wanted to be spared further walking. "Do you know anybody who has a car?" And by noon she was in a dust-choked Chevy heading home. "You better hold the door," the driver advised, "or it might fall off." "Then it falls," she said, her arms firmly crossed. At one point they passed through one of those godforsaken blisters of a community that frequently afflict the arteries between the major cities, and assemblages of shacks that seem to have been deposited in situ by a hurricane or other calamity. The only visible commerce was a single goat carcass hanging unfetchingly from a rope, peeled down to its corded orange musculature, except for it was hyphened. Except for the skin of its face, which was still attached like a funeral mask. He'd been skinned very recently. The flesh was still shivering under the shag of flies. Billy didn't know if it was the heat or the 2 beers she drank while the Commodero sent for his cousin, or skinned goat, or dimmed memories of her lost years, but our girl could have sworn that a man sitting in a rocking chair in front of one of the hovels had no face, and he waved at her as she passed, but before she could confirm it, the pueblito vanished into the dust. Did you see something? Her driver sighed, because I can barely keep my eyes on the road. I thought you didn't know. Oops. Nope. 2 days after her return, the cold had settled in the pit of her stomach like something drowned in there. She didn't know what was wrong. Every morning she was vomiting. It was La Inca who saw it first. Well, you finally did it. You're pregnant. No, I'm not, Billy rasped, wiping the fetid mash from her mouth. But she was. That's it for today. Revelation is the next part of chapter 3. So that was a long part. We've got several shorter parts now coming up. So this is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room. Well, we are reading The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room. Woo, my eyes are tired too. I'm the teacher. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom.